Hi everyone, I'm June from the Australian Museum. Today I'm going to present about a preliminary assessment of the effects of the bushfires on land snails in northern parts of New South Wales. So we are most familiar with the garden snails and snails that we can find in our parks, but there are actually a lot more variety of snails in New South Wales than you would have thought. So in this state itself, there are 856 species, including currently undescribed ones. And it comes in a variety of shapes and sizes, with the greatest species diversity and endemism in the east of the Great Dividing Range, especially in central and northeastern parts of the state, where there's a higher humidity, a lot more rainforest patches, and a lot more limestone outcrops, which are the best habitats for land snails to survive and thrive. And different species have different susceptibility to environmental changes depending on their environmental adaptations. But generally speaking, land snails like high humidity areas. So why are land snails of particular concern when it comes to bushfire impacts? Well, in 2019 and 2020, the bushfires in New South Wales are especially extensive and intensive. And this includes the burning of wet habitats like rainforests, vine thickets, and the wet sclerophyll forest, which are great places for land snails to survive in. So two main studies have identified the number of land snail species affected by these bushfires based on historical records and the percentage of the species' distribution range being burnt by these bushfires. The first study by the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment used the Atlas of Living Australia records and identified 17 species where 100% of their known ranges falls within the fire zone. The second study by Hyman et al. Used Australian Museum records and identified 11 species where 100% of its known ranges falls within the fire zone. In total, 206 species have been impacted by the bushfires to some extent. But for the purposes of this presentation, we will be focusing on northern New South Wales, narrowing down to 30 species of the highest priority. And studies elsewhere around the world has suggested that bushfires will lead to a reduction in the abundance and species richness of land snails, land snail communities. But this will gradually rebound as time progresses after fire. And some studies have also suggested that fires can cause a shift in the land snail community from wet habitat adapted species to drier habitat adapted species. So, but then the impacts on bushfires on New South Wales land snails is not known. No studies has been done yet for New South Wales land snails. So with this in mind, we asked two questions. First, did the bushfires cause extinctions of priority species in northern New South Wales? And how grave, how serious were the impacts on these priority species, especially their distribution ranges? So to answer these two questions, we went out to the field and selected burnt and unburnt sites where we did time searches for each of these sites of 120 minutes per site. And at each of these sites, we target habitats associated with priority species, such as rainforest and gullies. And we counted live and fresh shells as alive, as in the species survived the fires. And at each of these sites, we also recorded the fire intensity and the conditions to cross-check the fire map that was done with remote sensing, cross-checks to see if what's on the fire map is actually happening on the ground. So the first question, did the bushfires cause any extinctions of these priority species? No. All 30 priority species were redetected in this survey. And the reason is, at landscape level, At landscape level, the fires are extensive and severe. But if you zoom into the local level, you will find that topography and microhabitats play a role in sorting, protecting certain parts of the landscape from fires. So give you an example here. First example, in the Gibraltar Range, this region experienced extensive bushfires. But because the region is characterized by deep gullies and steep slopes, you can see that these fires did not cover the entire region. We surveyed 3 sites here. All of them are burned to some degree, and we find living individuals of all 6 priority species known from this region, including 4 species that are endemic to this mountain range. And at each of these sites, you can see, a comparison of the burnt and unburned site, the pictures here. And both burnt and unburned sites still retain substantial ground cover of leaf litter, where these leaf litter are important habitats for the 6 priority species. The second example that I want to give is the Mount Sebastopol, which is a limestone outcrop in the Macleay Valley near Kempsey. This region, again, experienced extensive and intensive bushfires. And it is a mosaic of a low number of unburnt patches of vegetation, with a lot of burnt areas ranging from low, medium, high to severe burnt areas. But when we were on the ground and we checked it against the fire maps, we realized that fire maps did not capture the fine-scale reality on the ground. In fact, there is a narrow band of unburnt habitat along the base of this limestone cliff and ridge. And it is in these kind of unburnt areas that we surveyed 3 sites here, 1 partially burnt, 2 unburnt, and we found living and fresh individuals of all 12 priority species, including 8 species that are endemic to this region of limestone outcrops. To give you an idea, this is a picture of one of the sites, and you can see that there's deep leaf litter layer. It's very thick leaf litter layer, unburnt vine thickets on one side and unburnt limestone cliffs on the other. And we can find all the priority species in this area and their respective microhabitats. So overall, this sort of pattern can be seen across all the sites that we have been to. And we found that all 30 priority species can be rediscovered to some extent, suggesting that the priority species have survived the bushfires. Second question, how serious were the impacts on priority species? Overall, of the 30 priority species that we have assessed in our survey sites, 6 species were redetected at 100% of the sites with historical records, suggesting that the bushfires have not substantially impacted their distribution range. 9 species were redetected at 51 to 99% of the sites with historical records, with some supplemented with new site records and substantial range extensions. Thus, it suggests that the bushfires have not substantially impacted their distribution range. But what really we want to focus on are the 15 species that were detected at 50% or less of the sites with historical records. And among these 15 species, we can further break it down to a list of species of greatest concern. After factoring in new records, we find that 5 species have more sites detected than undetected, with some new sites records and range extensions, making them less of a concern. So now it comes down to the 10 species that are of greatest concern, because they have equal or more sites undetected than detected. These species effectively have reduced ranges based on our survey results. But it is difficult to definitively say that fires are the main drivers for this 10 species reduction in distribution range because of several factors. First, among the 10 species, 6 of them are difficult to detect. we have detected these species in very small numbers in localized spots within our sites. And so some species, like the 3 species on the right, we have only found 1 specimen per species in our survey of all their historical sites, which amounts to about 30 liters of leaf litter per specimen, suggesting very low population densities. Or maybe we have targeted the wrong, or maybe we have not targeted their right microhabitats. So these 6 species would need more intensive searches to redetect them, verify their presence in both burnt and unburnt sites. Second, there might be some species with seasonal abundance, for example, this Mysticarium paratus, which we suspect to have a boom and bust cycle of abundance based on previous field observations. Perhaps our survey occurred during the bust phase of the cycle, where abundance of the species is so low that detection is difficult. So a more in-depth study of these species across its wider range in New South Wales and their population dynamics is needed to redetect these species. And finally, there are some species that have taxonomic issues, like these 3 species here, that needs to be reviewed and verified to confirm the species identification. So this study has a lot of caveats. It's difficult to compare the pre-fire and post-fire distribution range. We don't have a complete knowledge of the distribution range for each species. And the burnt areas tend to be woodland in higher slopes, and unburnt areas tend to be rainforest in gullies. So burnt and unburnt areas are structured by landscape. And there are several taxonomic issues that needs to be dealt with to recheck the species identity of historical records versus the current records. And of course, survey effort may not have captured all the possible habitats of the survey site. So non-detection of the species does not necessarily mean the species is extinct. So the key lessons: it is a complex picture when it comes to bushfire impacts on land snails. Of course, our worst fears did not come true. There were no extinction of priority species. But generally, land snails have survived in burnt areas, especially in areas where there is a mosaic of refugia, unburnt refugia, like rainforest areas. And most of these priority species are rainforest dwelling, and most of these rainforests are unburnt. Now, 10 species, we have identified 10 species that needs more in-depth study to verify if the bushfire actually impacted their distribution. But our surveys cannot quantify the effects of fire. We don't know if population size has changed before the fire and after the fire. And we do not know what are the future effects, long-term effects of the fire. For example, burnt rainforest might transition or transform into drier habitats like grassland or woodland. So we have a full species list that we want to use in the next step to analyze the landscape community characteristics against the fire effects. So that would be the next step for us. But that's what we have at the moment. So special thanks to the New South Wales National Park and Wildlife Service, Forestry Corporation, and landowners for allowing us to do field work on their lands. And thanks to Anna Mizali and Andrew Ruger from Museums Victoria for joining us in our field trip to look for snails. And thank you to Mandy Reid and Alison Miller from Australian Museum for curation materials. And of course, special thanks to the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment for funding this project. Thank you for listening to my talk.